what we want to think about first when we're starting off the semester is religious studies as a discipline itself. So I would think that what I'm going to say to some of you will strike you as a bit commonsensical. And you might say, why am I pointing this out? Well, it's to avoid confusions that will come up later on, to avoid the kind of confusions that will show up over and over again if we don't get them addressed at the beginning. So religious studies as a discipline, it's only been around as a discipline for about 100 years. And it really didn't take off until, a few decades ago. A lot of times when people were studying religion, they would study religion from a particular perspective. So usually when we talk about teaching religion or learning religion, what we meant was learning a religion, and we meant learning that from within the perspective of that religion, being committed to that religion. So you would go to, if you're Catholic, you would go to CCD, and in CCD they're probably not going to teach you about, the whole variety of religions, and they're making some presuppositions about the truth of Christianity, and that the Catholic Church would be, the best place to go for that. If you go to a madras, you're going to be learning about Islam, and odds are you're going to be learning about one particular way of looking at it, because, we tend to specialize in that way. And it's going to be from a committed perspective. If you go to Hebrew school, odds are they're going to have you reading, Hebrew texts, and what would be the earliest Hebrew text we've got our hands on, the Torah. And why would they be doing that? So that you could read them as a believer. Religious studies is a little bit different. We're studying religion from a not necessarily committed perspective. So one of the features of religious studies that I want to point out is, let's put it like this. There's no faith commitment required or presupposed. And if we're doing it well, this doesn't mean that you can't have, some sort of religious belief or practice coming into it as a learner, as a teacher, as a researcher, but you kind of bracket it. You put it on hold so that it doesn't interfere with what it is that you're trying to study. Because, if you think about it, if you're not just studying one particular religion, but a variety of different religious groups and traditions, you're generally having to approach other people's views. And if you've already decided from the very beginning, I'm only going to listen to what I think is relevant, important, true, then it's very hard to hear other people, especially when you know that they disagree with you on some fundamental points. So religious studies is going to be different than something like theology. Theology, if you were to study that, it's going to be, Christian theology, or Muslim theology, or Jewish theology, or Buddhist theology. There's different words for these sorts of things. But we use this category of theology to talk about something where there is a particular commitment. So everybody's clear about that, right? It doesn't mean that you can't have commitments of your own, or express those sort of views, that your own personal experiences have somehow become irrelevant as we're going through these chapters. It just means that you don't take them as being, how should we put it, being determinative of what's going on. You might say that we stop short of certain questions. You say, what do religious people of these different groups actually think, teach? Why do they think so? We don't say, are they right? We don't worry about that so much. That would be getting into theology. So that's one important connection. Another thing is that religious studies is multidisciplinary. I often misspell words, so you'll see me looking at them from time to time. If I misspell something, let me know too, because I don't want to just leave it up here incorrect for the whole class period. So when we say something is multidisciplinary, what do we mean? It's a fancy word. Have you guys encountered this before? Sometimes we say interdisciplinary. Is that a term that you've run across? What do you think we mean by that? Yeah.
Well, breaking down the word, I'd assume that there's like different categories. There's multiple things, but it's all like semi-strict.
Semi-strict.
Under
Oh,
something, but there could be like...
When you have a discipline, there's some rigor, some strictness to it.
But there's like different things for them.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point, that there has to be some sort of rigor. You can't count anything whatsoever as religious studies. There has to be some sort of studies element to it. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah.
It means that it delves into different fields to examine, like you can use economics or
Yeah.
science or psychology.
Very good. And now each of those is associated with its own particular kind of rigor and brings a perspective to it. So when you study things from an economics perspective, you're not studying it from a literary perspective. And in literature, it's not the case that anything goes, that every interpretation is just as good as any other one. You just ask a literature professor about that. A historical interpretation is going to be a bit different than a sociological interpretation. And they might draw on each other. Some of the fields that religious studies is going to draw on are themselves rather multidisciplinary, like geography. That's a multidisciplinary field. History, there's different divisions in it. You have cultural history, and economic history, and legal history. What do you think, just sort of, guessing off the top of your head, what would you say that the fields that religious study would draw on would most likely be? Yeah?
Like a historical perspective?
Yeah, history plays a big part in religious studies. You notice our textbook is from a historical, chronological perspective. That's the overarching order that they're using for it. What else? Yeah?
Maybe science?
Okay, now when you say science, that covers, we should always talk about the sciences, because there's no one single thing. What are the sciences that come to mind?
Well, just all the stories and belief that people have regarding religion, whether or not it's physically or actually possible, and there's like a lot of faith involved in whether it's actually possible scientifically. I don't know, just compared.
Yeah, again, we're not really worried about that. We're not taking a stand on whether this is true or not at this point. A lot of what you're talking about would be a philosophy of religion. Oftentimes when science strays over into religion, it does bad science. When you see natural scientists or neurobiologists trying to talk about the religious impulse, when you start probing it, it often turns out to be rather questionable. But that takes us a bit out of the field of religious studies as such. But some of the sciences are involved. What are other of the sciences? What are some of the actual disciplines that we call the sciences? You guys are probably associating science with like physics, chemistry, biology. Those are natural sciences. What are other sciences that we have?
Social science?
Yeah, here in the States we call them social sciences. In French and in German, these are called the human sciences because they have to do with the human subject. So what would those include? Yeah.
Would it be political science?
Yes, political science is an important part of it. What are other social sciences that we study? Think about the ones that we have available here at Marist. Yeah.
Psychology.
Mm-hmm. A tendency to leave out the why. What else? Yeah.
Sociology?
Mm-hmm. Any others that come to mind? I don't think we have a specialization in it here. What about anthropology? Do we have that as a major here at Marist? I didn't think we did. You could also put in economics, often called the dismal science, right? What else do you think would fit in? So we've covered the gamut of the sciences that are, oh, there's one other. You can call it a social science, I suppose. It really connects together a lot of other fields. Archaeology can be quite important for studying religion. Yeah?
What's anthropology?
Anthropology? Sometimes it ends up blending in a bit with sociology. Anthropology is literally the study of human beings, anthropos. What is it that makes us human? What is it that's essential to us? What it's turned into is largely a set of different disciplines that are connected with each other, like cultural anthropology, where you're doing, examinations of this culture. So you might go into, for example, an old Iraqi walled city and look at the culture of the people there and try to do some sort of narrative of what's going on with them. And you might actually draw on sociological or psychological concepts and techniques. These all tend to blend into each other quite a bit. What else? We've got the natural or the social sciences. We've got history. What else might be important for religious studies? Yeah.
Philosophy.
Yeah, philosophy fits in with it. Generally, philosophy on religion, right? Not so much worries about what's the science versus religion stuff, but things about the nature of religious language, or the role that narrative plays in our understanding of the world. What else might fit in there under the rubric of religious studies?
Literature.
Yeah. Now we're getting into the humanities, aren't we? History, philosophy, literature. I'm not gonna try to summarize all the different ones, but let's just say fine arts as well. Religious artwork plays a very important role. Music often plays a role in ritual. So you notice that you've got all these different perspectives. Oh, I should put also linguistics up there as well. Any one of those may be useful for religious studies, and the person who's doing religious studies is kind of a jack of all trades. What differentiates him or her from other researchers is that he or she is primarily focused on studying religion and spends an awful lot of time actually delving into religious texts, religious narratives, what it is that people in this particular religious group believe, feel, do, what their history is. So it's kind of hard to put a finger exactly on what is religious studies. It's easier to do that with something like psychology. Although any one of these other disciplines, once you start digging into it, how many of you, by the way, are majoring in any of these? So, as you're going through your studies, you may think that you know exactly what psychology or political science is. Just go to another school and see how it's taught there, and see what the divergences are, and how the instructors conceive of it there. And you'll realize that although there is a unity to each one of these fields, it's a lot harder to define than we originally presented as. So, why did I give you all this? Just to give you an idea of what you're getting into. There's a number of other things that are connected with religious studies that I want to touch on before we actually look at the text. The next thing I want to talk about, we can call this basic attitudes about the diversity of religions. So when we say diversity, what do we mean? We mean that not everybody's on the same page, not everybody's coming from the same perspective. Think about those of you who studied world religions. How many major world religions would you say there are? Just pick a number offhand.
15.
5, 15. Any other guesses? That's a big range, 5 to 15, isn't it? It depends on how we consider major, where the cutoff is. Notice already we've got some divergences in what we're calling, significant or major or relevant. Even within a particular religious tradition, is everybody on the same page? Do all Muslims believe exactly the same thing about the role of the hadith, or who should hold authority within the religious community? No? I mean, there's a big divergence between the two major groups, Sunni and Shia. And then if you're a Sunni, do all Sunnis, see things exactly the same way? No, there's different legal schools, different ways of practicing it. The Shiites are spread out over a number of different groups. 12er Shiites are not the same thing as 7er Shiites, are not the same thing as Druze. And we can do the same thing for any other group. Do all Buddhists believe the same thing? Not exactly. And we can go on and on like that. So there's a diversity of religions. And here's where we actually get into what you could call the issue of truth claims. How do we deal with the fact that there are other people who see things very differently than us, given whatever perspective you happen to hold? And there's in the philosophy of religion and in theology, they often talk about three main attitudes. They're all isms. Exclusive. So we've got these three different positions. There's actually more than that, but let's start with that. We've got pluralism, and you can think of this as sort of a spectrum. Pluralism all the way to exclusivism. See the word exclusive, what do you think? What does that make you think of? Yeah.
Just one like this.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. If you're an exclusivist, there's one true perspective. All the rest, and I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit, but I want to sort of stress this. All the rest of them are dead wrong. At best, they may participate in just a glimmer of the truth, the correctness that is offered by the one true faith, the one correct perspective. All the rest of them, no good. So, what would be examples of this? Christian fundamentalism, which, by the way, is not, if you want to be strict about it, is not the same thing that the media calls fundamentalism. They use the word in a very loose and sloppy way. Actual Christian fundamentalists believe that there are certain fundamentals of the Christian faith that you have to believe or you're not a Christian, and that you can't hold fellowship with anybody who doesn't accept those fundamentals. So that would be a great example of an exclusivist point of view, wouldn't it? Islamic, what they call Islamic fundamentalism, I prefer the term radical Islam or totalitarian Islam. It would be another example of this. A lot of smaller groups that tend to be, apart from the rest of the society, separating themselves out, will have this sort of perspective. Let's go to the other end. So if we're talking about pluralism, what does that term mean? That's a relatively new word, by the way. I think it's probably about as old as me, which is not very I'm old in comparison to you, because I'm twice your age. I'm 43. But in terms of, language, that's not very, very old. It might be a little bit older than that. It might be from the 60s or the 50s. I might even be wrong about that. But it's not been around for a very long time. What do we mean when we say pluralist? Yeah.
Can it be like believing one different perspective, like a religion, and not belong to one?
Say that a little
Or
bit
not
louder.
belong to one religion, like
Not belonging to them, like mixing together
yeah,
different
or
things?
something like that, and accepting it.
That would be more like what we call syncretism or synthesis, blending things together. This would be something that somebody could, in fact, believe from the perspective of certain faith commitments, but they'd be believing it about other religions. You ever heard this expression, there's, many paths but one goal, that sort of... That's an example of the kind of pluralism that a lot of scholars mean when they use this term. There's let's call it one true goal, many equally valid paths. So, certain perspectives within Hinduism would fit this. There's, for example, a lot of practitioners of Hinduism are worshippers of Vishnu, and that's the aspect under which the divine is understood. And Vishnu has appeared in the form of a number of avatars, a number of ways in which he became manifest on earth. And if you actually look at the literature, they're not all things like, Krishna and guys in India. A lot of Vaishnavites are willing to say, yeah, Jesus was an avatar of Vishnu, a form in which Vishnu took to go help out those people in the Middle East. Doesn't usually fly too well with Christians when Hindus say that sort of thing. Some of them may even go so far as to say Muhammad. What was that? Which drives Muslims nuts. But that's a good example of this sort of pluralist point of view. It's all really the same. Everyone's got their own little path, or each society's got its own path, but they're all equally good. So we've got something here in the middle, inclusivism. What do you think that would be like? If it's somehow in between these two. Yeah.
I was going to say, like, you're part of one religion, but you see other possibilities in another religion, but you just don't go through with it, but you're kind of open to it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Let's call it one truist perspective. Other perspectives are more or less true. So, what would be some examples of this? Again, if you think about Islam and its attitudes towards other religions, in particular towards Judaism and Christianity, and if we leave aside, sort of very hardcore Hanbali, Sunni interpretations like Wahhabism or Deoband, schools, and we think about, sort of the vast majority, what do they say about Christians and Jews? Well, they're peoples of the book. They have a form of revelation. It's not as good as the Quran, but it's still, it's not chopped liver. It's not totally wrong. It's at least on the way towards where they ought to go. And this is the way that a lot of schools of Buddhism will not only talk about other religions, but even other schools of Buddhism. There's like a whole hierarchy. If you want the really great stuff, it's here. This is the truest message, but there's people who are getting this message, and that's not bad. It's better than nothing at all. That would be inclusivism. A lot of Christian churches are examples of inclusivist churches where they'll say, well, we go to this one because we think that we actually have the best understanding of these things. But we're willing to grant that other Christians are onto something. They just, They don't have what we have. You see how that's quite different than the exclusivist interpretation? Now, if you want to do religious studies, which of these can you hold? Which can you enter the classroom with and sort of bring into things?
Pluralism?
Yeah, you could be a pluralist. As a matter of fact, that might actually encourage you to seek out information about other faiths, you know. Could you be an exclusivist? Well, you could, but you could only study the chapter belonging to your particular group. And, you know, so you'd only show up for one day, or the rest of the time you'd be kind of fuming there thinking, this is all BS. By the way, exclusivism is not only possible from a religious perspective. Think about the spectrum of atheism. Somebody who's you know, decided, you know, that the religion really isn't true. You can be a secular exclusivist as well. You can also be like a secular crusader. It's all crap. Terrible stuff. We should never study any of this. You're not going to get much out of a religious studies class if you come in with that sort of point of view. That's not the entire spectrum available for atheists. There are equivalents like inclusivism. You know, religion may offer something to its practitioners. Some religions may be better or worse in terms of these things. Do you think this is all the possible perspectives? This is the way a lot of people present it. This is it. This is all you could possibly have. Yeah.
What if you're, excuse me, of the opinion, like, not necessarily exclusivist, but like you've been so indoctrinated to just like follow it blindly? Would that follow anything? Like if you're following...
You're probably going to be an exclusivist then, right?
Yeah, because you're looking at it from the one paradigm you've always had.
Yeah, I mean, you're just sort of unthinkingly exclusivist. You know, it's possible to be an exclusivist from principle after like having thought things through and say, look, this is just, you know, I looked at all the evidence and the data, this is just where I end up, and there are some very brilliant people out there who fit into the exclusivist mode. Yeah.
Could there be something where you like, maybe you're pluralist, but like there's one specific religion that you think is dead wrong, or like?
Oh, that's interesting. There are many paths, but they're not all equally valid. Some of them are actually, you know, bad paths. Yeah, there's a discussion about pluralism that they call this divergent pluralism. So let me put this down here. And why is it divergent? Because they don't say that there's one goal. You know, for example, if you're a very traditional Theravadan Buddhist, and you haven't sort of turned the conception of nirvana into something very much like heaven, which a lot of Buddhists have done historically, the Christian conception of heaven and the Buddhist conception of nirvana don't actually look like the same thing. A lot of people want to glom them together and say, well, everybody's after bliss or everybody's after transcendence. But maybe the different religions are actually after different things. And if that's the case, then maybe some of them actually have better and worse, goals that they're aiming at. If there was a religion, how many of you have seen that movie Chronicles of Riddick recently? None of you have seen it? I mean, it came out like in the last 8 years. It's a fiction movie. It's science fiction, right? And there's this religion, the necromongers, and it's basically a religion worshiping death. And they go around, they take over planets, and they kill everybody or turn them into slaves, and they're very creepy kinds of people. But imagine that was an actual religion here on earth. It would be quite possible for a Hindu or a Christian who otherwise is willing to say, yeah, there's a lot of different paths and they're going different places, and a lot of those places are pretty good, to say, yeah, that one I think that's a bad one. We shouldn't advocate that and say, oh, they're headed towards the same thing. That's another possibility. As a matter of fact, I think that this is actually, in some respects, a bit more respectful of the distinctiveness of people's religious traditions, to be willing to recognize that not everybody is doing exactly the same thing, or not everybody is basically aiming for the same thing, but doing a worse job at it than whatever particular group I belong to. These are workable options. Another possibility that they talk about is what's called relativism. You guys may remember this from your philosophy classes. Anyone remember that term? Relativism. Usually teachers want to disabuse you of it right away. Don't be a relativist. What did relativism mean? I mean, it's in the word, relative. What about your family relatives? Truth perspectives are all relative to your particular point of view. So you have your truth, and I have my truth, and even though they contradict each other, they're both equally true. Just your truth is true for you, and my truth is true for me, and maybe also for him because he happens to see things the same way. But your truth is good for you too. Everything's equally valid within that. You can adopt that kind of perspective too. But it tends to make it hard to make judgments, other than from your perspective within that bubble that you're in, within the bubble that we're in, making that. So these are kind of the gamut. And I want you to think about this. Think about where you actually fit into this, and whether you're happy with being in the slot that you're in. You can move from one to the other. And it's important to know where you're coming from as you're moving into the field of religious studies. The last thing that I want to touch on before we look at the text is what we call religious literacy. And that's something that religious studies should provide you with, if you're actually putting in the work that you're expected to put in. Religious literacy is a variety of what we would call cultural literacy. So, let me pose a really easy question to you. Nazis, good or bad in general? Yeah. Now, how do you know? Have you met any Nazis lately? Did a Nazi knock over your mailbox or bully you when you were a kid? So how do you know that the Nazis were bad? Not everybody actually thinks that. Thankfully, those who don't are in the minority these days. But how do you know? How did you arrive at that so quickly?
Because we know what their motives are, what they've done, what their beliefs were.
Yeah. Now that's part of cultural literacy. I've known people who have given pre-tests in humanities classes in certain parts of the United States where it would include questions like who was Adolf Hitler, and people wouldn't know the answer to that. Imagine if you didn't know that, trying to make sense out of a lot of things that people would talk about. I don't let, in my ethics classes, I don't let people use Nazi examples anymore because they're too easy. Everybody, is against the Nazis. Everybody knows they're supposed to be against the Nazis. I want them to actually pick harder examples because that's become so much a part of what you could call the network of concepts that we have at our disposal. Let me give you a slightly tougher one. Alexander the Great. What did he do exactly? Why was he an important guy?
He was a conqueror and took over a lot of the Mediterranean area.
Well, some of the Mediterranean, parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. What else? Anything else come to? He actually took over large parts of the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East, where, by the way, he's often known as Alexander the Terrible, because he destroyed the Persian Empire. He imposed Greek polytheistic religion on people who weren't really into that sort of thing, like, for example, the Jews in Judea at that time. He actually made it as far as India. And then his troops said, that's enough. We're kind of tired of marching around. They've been going with this guy for 20 years. It's a long time to march around and fight people. Now, how did you actually know anything about Alexander the Great? Well, because you possess some degree of cultural literacy. And if you know something about Alexander the Great, then you might also know something about somebody else who really admired him, like a lot of people did, like, say, Julius Caesar. You guys are all familiar, I suppose, with that guy. Cultural literacy is really like knowing a bunch of different things that are connected with each other and being able to draw those connections. And when you've got a certain critical mass, when you've got certain structures in place, when you get new information, you're able to draw analogies, you're able to figure out where things fit in with each other. You're able to make sense of the conversations that educated people are having with each other. You can follow what the talking heads on the better opinion programs are referring to. If you don't have that, you're kind of at a loss when it comes to some important things. And, you can talk about all sorts of other kinds of literacy as well, right? So when we're talking about religious literacy, we're talking about matters of religion and how religions grew and how they're connected with each other and who important people were. Like, here's a good example. We just had Martin Luther King Day a few days ago, right? Everybody knows why the guy was important, I think. What did he do? Come on.
Civil rights movement.
Yeah, that's what we identify him with. What was his job? What was his day job? Besides organizing marches. Yeah.
He was a reverend.
Exactly. He was a religious figure. The civil rights movement was primarily a religious movement within the United States. It had a whole rhetoric. King's speeches, if you read them, those are biblical references that he's making and reworking. And some of them are to other people who, like John Winthrop, the city on a hill idea. That played a very important role in American politics. What denomination did King belong to? Anyone know? Was he a Catholic? Was he Greek Orthodox? Was he Presbyterian? Was he Baptist? Yeah.
I'm assuming he must have been Southern Baptist.
Well, he wouldn't have been Southern Baptist, but he was Baptist, yeah.
Was he a Lutheran?
No, he actually studied some Lutheran figures in seminary, but he was a Baptist. And knowing something about that tells you something about what went on with them and how the churches were organized. That's part of religious literacy. This class should provide you with a lot of those other dots that you don't currently have. Now, why has this become a big issue these days? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but why is this important? I mentioned last class that a lot of people thought that with modernization, religion should fade away. Has religion faded away, or is it still an extremely important force within the world? More than half the people in the world today are committed to one religion or another. So it's going to be important just for that. Does religion play a role in politics? Does it play a role in economics? Does it play a role in international policy making? Yeah, I mean, we learned this the hard way. The way things went in Iraq and not knowing it. A lot of people who didn't have religious literacy, not knowing about the difference between Sunnis and Shiites and how to negotiate things with them. Why do you think that you guys didn't get a lot of this in middle school and high school? A lot of this information. Yeah.
It's all kind of like touchy stuff, and I don't think we're like mature enough to really appreciate it and fully comprehend.
Well, that's interesting. So there's two different things there. It's touchy-feely stuff. Okay. So so's the arts, so's music, so's history. Really, when you get down to it, because they're divergent interpretations of everything. But we teach those things, and then you said people think that you're not mature enough. That's really interesting to say, because how do you develop maturity? It's only by actually doing things, by engaging with things. If you cut people off from stuff, you actually prevent them from being able to mature in certain important respects. A lot of people don't want to talk about religion particularly in public schools, but even in parochial schools, in part because they may be poorly informed about it, they may be lacking in religious literacy, or there's this feeling that, look, we can't be teaching religion, right? Because we'll talk about this a bit more. First Amendment, we're not supposed to have a national religion, we're not supposed to establish a religion here. And if you're teaching religion, like, if you do a class on the Bible in English class, Bible is literature, aren't you teaching religion? Aren't you proselytizing them? Aren't you enforcing some sort of religious mindset onto people? Not if you take the religious studies perspective, where you say, well, we're interested in what do these people actually think, what do these texts mean, not in who's right or who's wrong. As a matter of fact, there's a big difference between teaching religion and teaching about religion. Teaching about religion, you're not actually making some sort of faith perspective. You're not requiring anybody to believe anything other than what the documents say. The Puritans actually did show up here, and they actually did believe these things, and here's what their texts were. But you're not actually saying you have to believe what the Puritans taught. That would be teaching religion. And the Supreme Court made a rigid distinction between this quite a while ago. Back in a case called Abingdon Township versus Shemp in 1963. And in the thing they said, it's very important to teach about religion in school. Because without it, you don't understand history, you don't understand human development, you don't understand the world that we live in, you're cut off from a lot of other people that belong to religious groups within this incredibly diverse society. We can add to that if you're going to be globally involved or globally engaged, you need to know quite a bit about religions in order to be able to meet people where they are. You don't have to believe in anything that they believe, you don't have to buy into any of it, but you need to know about it. It's much more important to understand than to worry about agreement. And that's what religious studies is about. It's supposed to provide you ultimately with what we call religious literacy.